First of all, thanks very much for the opportunity to DRNI for me to be able to do this talk today, especially thanks to Carol. So as Carol mentioned, my name is Robert Whelan. I'm from the School of Psychology and the Global Brain Health Institute in Trinity College, Dublin. I'm based down in the Institute of Neuroscience as well, the National Institute of Neuroscience in Trinity. So today, it'll just take a second for my slides to catch up. I think they're on a slow day. There we go. So I'll give a bit of a whistle-stop tour about, telling you a little bit about what neuroimaging is. And the focus of the talk today will be on brain health. So a lot of neuroimaging clinically is used to look at disease and to investigate various disease parameters. But what I'll try and do today is to give you some flavor of what's happening in the world of research and how we're using neuroimaging to look at healthy brains, essentially, and to see how health might play out over the course of somebody's lifespan and how neuroimaging can inform us about that. So I'll introduce a couple of topics based on the research that we do in Trinity. So one of them is this idea of a brain age score. So it's where you have perhaps a younger or an older brain relative to your chronological age. So you obviously have a chronological age and then your brain may be older or younger than that. Then I'll talk as well about this important concept of cognitive reserve, and really part of the story here is what imaging can't tell us. So there are some things that we can see on an MRI scan, for example, and then there are other things we can't, and these have implications in terms of people's health and their mental functioning. And just to summarize, I'll talk a little bit about where the field might be headed. There's a discipline called personalized medicine, or in this context it might be personalized aging, and there's great interest in this field using tools like neuroimaging and combining it with other information such as genetics in order to map a path for individual people and how their health, their own health might proceed. So just to step back a long way actually and talk about before neuroimaging. So neuroimaging is really a fantastic tool, and it gives us so much opportunity and the ability to do amazing things. And really it's such a huge step forward, because before neuroimaging, we didn't really have any way of investigating specific parts of the brain or looking at how the brain performed in the normal course of things. So before neuroimaging, we had to rely on case studies of people who'd suffered traumatic brain injury and yet who had survived, so that their behavior could be observed. And probably just out of historical note, the most famous person in this context is a guy called Phineas Gage, who maybe lots of people have heard of. So he was working as a foreman on a railway in Vermont, and he was tamping the iron rod that you see here into the ground with dynamite to blast a hole, and he became distracted, and anyway the dynamite went off and this iron rod passed all the way through his skull. So this is a cast of his skull here, so it's quite a severe injury, but very surprisingly he lost consciousness for maybe a handful of seconds, and after that he was perfectly lucid. He could talk, he stayed awake, he talked to the doctor afterwards. And really the importance of this case is that his personality became changed afterwards in a very specific way. So he kind of had a bad personality afterwards, and used profane language where he wouldn't have before. And the point of this is that this was really the first indication that damage to a specific part of the brain could result in specific changes in personality, or possibly in memory as well, and so on. So before this, people didn't really know what the brain did or where the different functions or cognitive functions were stored in the brain. They kind of had this idea that it might be more widely distributed. So this was really the first example that perhaps the brain has some specific areas that have particular jobs to do. And of course, these kind of case studies aren't really satisfactory from a psychological point of view, because people develop compensation strategies afterwards. They don't necessarily tell us how the brain works in the normal course of things without this traumatic brain injury. So that's why something like neuroimaging is such a boon for us as cognitive neuroscientists, because we can look at the brain doing its normal job in a healthy context. And one of the main workhorses for this is a tool called magnetic resonance imaging. So people have probably seen something like this before. You may have had an MRI scan on your knee or on your shoulder or something like that. It's exactly the same tool that we use for brain imaging, for neuroimaging. And really it's a donut-shaped machine that has a superconducting magnet on the inside. So it's cooled by liquid helium to keep it very, very low, to keep the electrical resistance low. And it's a huge magnet that's very, very powerful, tens of thousands times more stronger than the Earth's magnetic field. And essentially what it does is it lines up some of the atoms in your brain, and then these can be perturbed by radio waves, and based on how the atoms move around, you can figure out what kind of substance you're looking at. So you can do this inside the brain, and you can get really nice pictures like this. So we don't need anymore to rely on case studies of people who've suffered some injury to their brain. We can look at the normal healthy brain very, very safely. So MRI is really, really safe. You can do it every day. There's no radiation associated with it. You can image in utero. So people have done brain imaging on fetuses in utero. It's that safe. So it's a really great tool, and it's a great tool for research and also in a clinical context as well. So we get very good high resolution images of the brain. And just to say that we've just got a new one of these in the Institute of Neuroscience that was just installed a couple of months ago, and we look forward to many years of being able to do this type of scanning in the Institute. So there might be a slight difference between the way that neuroimaging is used in clinical context versus how it's used in a research context. So for a clinician, they might use something that's more akin to this. So they might get various different types of scans. So you can ask for different kinds of scan and get different pieces of information from it. And probably a radiologist would want to just look at these on a light box or something like that. So they would do a more visual inspection of the images, whereas in research we tend to maybe use this type of scan here a bit more, so a high resolution scan, and we divide it up into voxels, which are three-dimensional pixels. So if you think about a pixel on your TV screen, a voxel is just a three-dimensional version like that. And then we tend to put that into a computer and then do some analyses on it in a computer. We tend not to look at images so much. So a lot of this is computerized and turned into digital form. Another kind of neuroimaging that's very relevant to Alzheimer's and dementia is what's called a PET scan, which actually uses antimatter to bind to certain substances. You can use it to bind to certain substances and tell you, for example, about levels of beta amyloid in the brain. This is much less common. It's not really routine. Some reasons for that are because it's very expensive. It's not so repeatable, so it does involve administration of a radioactive substance. Not really very much radioactivity, but it's not something that you can do every day, and it's certainly not something that you could use in a brain health context, because you really need a good reason to give people this kind of scan. So unlike MRI that you can do every day and there's no real safety barrier to it, something like PET you can't do every day, which is why it can't be routinely used for brain health purposes. So this is a slightly complicated slide, but it's one you might see a lot if you ever go to a conference on Alzheimer's. You'll see some version of this slide, and I tried to pick the clearest one that I could, and I'll talk a little bit through it. So really just the takeaway message from this slide is that brain changes happen prior to symptoms. So before you see any memory issues or any symptoms of clinical relevance, the brain has already been changing for many years, perhaps maybe 15 years beforehand. And just to talk a little bit through this slide. So in time, this is somebody who is cognitively normal. They have no clinical symptoms. They have no memory problems. But some of the early signs of brain signs of Alzheimer's are starting to build up. And that's represented by these lines here, like beta amyloid or tau. And then as that progresses, so this is time along here, maybe 10 or 15 years later, there might be a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment. So some of these markers are getting quite high, the brain markers especially. You see other things like brain structure and changes to the brain structure, changes to the clinical function as well, to some extent in this phase. And then that moves on into the dementia phase, where all of these things are reaching a maximum. So the place where my research is and where I'm focused is this space here. So people are cognitively normal, so there's maybe very few clinical signs. They don't really have too many memory problems. There are some changes in things like beta amyloid and tau, but we're not detecting them because we don't use PET regularly. But we could use something like MRI here to try and detect these more subtle changes in brain structure. So really, here is where we're focused, because we want to develop a tool, or we want to discover something that will allow us to safely and easily detect the earliest signs of Alzheimer's before they manifest themselves in symptoms. So this is the area here. So one of the ways that we've done that, and lots of other people have used this method as well, is to use something called a brain predicted age difference score. And it's really quite simple and quite intuitive, and it's easy to understand. So what it means is that a person may have a brain that's, in one sense, and I'll talk a little bit in a second about where this comes from, that's age 70, but they themselves might be, chronologically, they might have just passed their 60th birthday. So they've got a brain that's age 70, they're only age 60. So then this gives them a plus 10 years brain pad score. So predicted age difference is the brain pad score. So therefore they have an older brain. And conversely, you can think about people who's age 60, but they have a brain that's more similar to a 50-year-old. And then they would have a minus 10 years brain pad score. So it's been used in lots of studies, maybe over 100 studies now at least have used this type of measurement. It's very easy to get. It takes maybe 5 minutes in an MRI scanner to generate this image. And then it's relatively simple to calculate somebody's brain age score. So just to give a very short view of where it might come from. So the way that these brain age scores are calculated, it's using most of the similar technology to something like Netflix or Google. So you're feeding in a lot of information into a computer algorithm, and they're returning back the answer that's telling you how old a person's brain is. So rather than talk through any of this, I put up a picture of a sausage maker, because that's really what it is. You get lots and lots of MRI scans, and you feed them into an algorithm into the computer, and you tell it what the ages of the people are, and it learns to identify the age of a brain from that. So that's what we've done in our research. We've just been able to go to publicly available MRI data. So we got thousands of scans, we fed them into a computer, and it learned how to identify a person's age from their MRI scan. And from that, you can generate this brain predicted age difference score for new participants who you haven't seen before. So one of the reasons why this brain pad is exciting and interesting, some of the reasons are because it's intuitive, it's easy to do, but it also correlates with a lot of things that are relevant for aging. So a lower brain pad score, so that is a younger brain, is associated with a lot of physiological markers that are important as people age, and that give insight into the potential clinical course of that person. So, for example, faster walking speed, which is just a really good test of somebody's physical health. And one of the things that this brain pad score might be tapping into is maybe more a general kind of physiological health as well. So not just brain health, but it might also be a marker for general physiological health. So maybe the brain might just be particularly sensitive in terms of picking up on somebody's overall health. Another thing that it correlates with is stronger grip strength. So this is just if you're given a device to squeeze, the a person's ability to squeeze this device is really, really predictive of lots of future health outcomes. It's really simple. It takes 2 seconds to do, and it's one of the best predictors of outcome, really, as people age. It's also associated with respiratory function, like so stronger lung function. And if you look down at the molecular level as well, there's this thing called allostatic load, where you can calculate how much wear and tear there is on a person's cells. So it's a marker really for not just their biological age, but how much stress they've endured over the course of their life. And this also correlates with BrainPad. And we've, several people have shown that this lower BrainPad is also correlated with better cognitive performance. So you can have a younger brain, and that will also be associated with things like better memory, better verbal fluency, so able to generate more words of starting with a given letter, for example, also correlates with BrainPad. One of the most striking studies was one that followed a birth cohort. So they took MRIs from these people at some point in the past, and then they calculated the brain age score. And what they were able to do is to show that there was an increased mortality risk depending on the age of the brain, measured years, several years before. So for every extra year on the brain age score, there was a 6% increased risk of death. And this was a very strong predictor. This was stronger than other, maybe more ostensibly plausible biological markers like DNA wear and so on. So that this brain health was actually a very, very sensitive marker of future health and mortality. And just to give a flavor of some of the some kind of results here. So this is a comparison of healthy people, people with MCI, and people with Alzheimer's disease. And the black bars represent the average brain predictive score. So you can, and each dot represents a person as well. So each dot represents a person's data point. So you can see that the healthy people had the lowest BrainPad. It's slightly higher for people with mild cognitive impairment, and maybe slightly higher again for people with Alzheimer's disease. So there certainly is a trend there, and it certainly seems to be good at discriminating amongst groups. Although the other thing that's worth noting is that there's quite a bit of overlap. So just because somebody has an old has a higher BrainPad score doesn't necessarily put them in one group or the other. It's really just a trend that they tend to belong to one group or the other depending on their BrainPad score. So can you do anything to keep your brain young? Well, lots of studies have shown that you can. It's certainly possible. And lots of studies have specifically looked at this BrainPad score and ways to lower it. So one way is to keep learning and keep moving. So for every year of education that somebody has, their BrainPad score decreases by 1 year. So in other words, their brain is younger by 1 year for every extra year of education. So education might be a hard thing to do, to generate more years of education. That's quite tough. So another variable that they found that was really quite important and predictive was just the number of flights of stairs that somebody climbed in a day. So there's a measure, I'm not sure how common it is here, but in America, they often measure this flights of stairs climbed. And for every additional flight of stairs climbed per day resulted in a decreased brain age of 7 months. So if you climb 2 flights of stairs a day, on average, your BrainPad score, your brain was younger by about 14 months and so on. So it seems again that it seems to be something related to physical health and brain health are really quite closely linked. Another study showed that amateur musicians tended to have lower BrainPad scores as well. So they compared non-musicians, professional musicians, and amateur musicians, and the amateur musicians tended to have the lowest BrainPad score. And the interesting thing about this study was that the professional musicians really didn't look a lot different from the non-musicians. And one reason they think for this is because the professional musicians are doing one thing very intensely, and rather than the amateur musicians who are probably doing lots of other things, and they also get to play some music as well. So there's some diversity there. And perhaps the professional musicians are stressed doing it too, because it's their job. So that it's a totally different dynamic. So the important thing here seems to be, doing it, practicing music, but not to the exclusion of anything else, that it's, you know, as part of a kind of a balanced lifestyle, that it's another thing to do that's also quite beneficial for your brain. And finally, just in this section is meditation as well. So this was published in kind of one of our top journals in neuroimaging. And if you look at groups of people at age 50, those who meditated had a BrainPad score of 7.5 years younger than those who didn't. So effectively, they had a younger brain. Those meditators had a younger brain. And probably the more interesting thing about this was that these effects tended to get stronger as people got older. So the effect became more pronounced as people went past the age of 50. So if you were 60, the effect was even more pronounced. So for every extra year over 50, the meditators' brains were nearly 2 months younger than their chronological age. So it tended to accelerate. So the older you are, the more benefit you can derive from meditation. So just to say a little bit about what structural neuroimaging can't tell us. So if we look at, these are MRI scans of a healthy person, and a healthy person in their 20s and a healthy person in their 80s. So this person has no problems at all. Or maybe you can see on your screen that there is some differences between them. So it's reasonably obvious. So these ventricles here, the fluid-filled areas, are slightly bigger in the healthy person in their 80s. The grooves tend to have a bit more fluid in them. The gyri, the gray matter, tends to be a little bit smaller as well. But the interesting thing about this is that if you saw scans of two people, you know, maybe one of them had lots of, you know, really big ventricles and really shrunken gray matter, they might be the same clinically, but even though their brains look a lot different, maybe one brain has a lot of pathology on it, and just looking at it, you would think that they should have a lot of clinical symptoms, but actually they present the same and they have the same behaviors. So part of this might be explainable by the concept of cognitive reserve. So Professor Jakob Stern is one of the main originators of this. And what this says is that the brain is adaptable. So your cognitive and functional brain processes are adaptable, and they can explain differences in cognition in response to brain aging or pathology. So if you've got something like high cognitive reserve, then even though there might be some pathology there associated with Alzheimer's or other neurodegenerative diseases, your behavior might not be so affected. So the kind of things that are influential on cognitive reserve are things like mental stimulation. So the idea here is that you build up a buffer or a reserve against the physical ailments of aging and neurodegenerative disease. So people who have more mental stimulation, maybe they have a job or they've got a hobby that's quite mentally stimulating, tend to have higher cognitive reserve. People who are healthier or keep an active lifestyle or have large social networks also tend to have higher cognitive reserve as well. And then conversely, people who have poor nutrition, let's say, and maybe alcohol misuse tend to have lower cognitive reserve. So the people on this side here, even if they have some physical signs of something like Alzheimer's, will actually cognitively be much better than people over here who may not have as many signs. So what this suggests is that something like cognitive reserve could in the future be an important component of diagnosing and characterizing aging and dementia. It's not really considered at the moment because there's no standard test for it. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to see if we can tap into this cognitive reserve using something like functional MRI. So functional MRI is different to structural MRI in that you can use the MRI scanner to look at what parts of the brain are active when you're doing a certain task. So for example, if you're trying to remember something, then you'll see areas of the brain light up that are involved in memory. And in this way, you can actually look at the functions of the brain. And one of the things that we're working on, I'm not sure if it's terribly clear from here, but one of my students is trying to develop a way of looking at cognitive reserve in this functional imaging. So it might give us some insight into being able to detect people who have high cognitive reserve, or what makes people with high cognitive reserve function so well. And just initial signs look like connectivity amongst the frontal areas of the brain. If that's good, then that tends to be associated with high cognitive reserve. So that's certainly an area that the field is actively working on at the moment. And just finally, just to wrap up and talk a little bit about where this might be going. So in medicine and kind of research in general, we often tend to think about people as being quite homogenous, but there's maybe for a few years now, there's a growing recognition that people are different. Everybody has different genetic background. They have different life influences. Some people, grow up with good nutrition. Some people grow up with bad nutrition, and so on. All of these things interact. Some people have stressful lives. Some people don't. So there is a field called precision medicine in general, but then people are thinking about this in terms of precision aging. And I just put a reference there at the bottom. That paper is freely available. But the idea is that, in future, if technology advances, that we might be able to look at somebody's unique genetic code. We might be able to figure out, what kind of risks they face in terms of their brain health in future. We might be able to put them into an MRI scanner, maybe give them a task and look at the functional MRI. And then based on that, we might be able to individualize an intervention for that person so that they get something specific to themselves. So maybe they need to do something that's more cognitively stimulating, or maybe for them, it's better to do some physical exercise, maybe to improve their vasculature, for example. So the idea is that each person will have a tailored intervention for themselves based on their genetic history and based on their own individual brain. So where this might leave us is that neuroimaging does have the potential for accurate and early identification of poor brain health. This may in future lead to earlier and better treatment, that we can identify it earlier, and maybe promote things like cognitive reserve in people. And this might improve ultimately people's quality of life, which is what it's all about at the end of the day. So with that, I'll stop, and I'm happy to take questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen now as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rob. That was really interesting. And I'm sure great news for all the amateur musicians. I'm sure there's a few online. Yeah. That was an interesting one. So we have a few questions that have come in, and I can read them out. You might be able to see them there. The first one was, can reoccurring kidney or bladder infections which affect mood be linked to dementia?
Certainly mood in itself. So regardless, I think, of the cause, mood is certainly one of those things that is a risk factor for it. So low mood or depression would be something that's a risk factor. Maybe, I'm not sure specifically about that. There are people looking at the link between kidney function. There's a group in Cork that look at the link between kidney function and dementia. So at a very molecular level, there is a link there. Everything is connected, and what we often think about as being neurotransmitters or chemicals associated purely with the brain or purely with the kidney, that there's some overlap there. I can probably follow up on that and just find the name of that group, because that's actually a link that they're looking at, specifically kidney to brain relationships and dementia.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Okay. So we'll get in touch with the person who asked that. Yeah. Do the brain changes that lead to dementia happen normally over time anyway?
No. So the path, the course is different for dementia. So there's normal healthy aging, and then the deviation from that would be something like dementia. So there will be characteristic features of dementia, like the buildup of amyloid and tau tangles, that would be specific to dementia, that don't normally happen in healthy aging. So there is a different trajectory there.
Yeah, great. And I suppose it's one of those messages, I think, that public health and Understand Together will be trying to get out, that dementia isn't a normal part of aging,
Yes,
so yeah. It's an important message, isn't it, that people don't just think, oh, it's a natural progression to dementia as you age, It's not necessarily the case, it is a disease. So can a layperson estimate their own brain predicted age?
Not really. So the way it's all done at the moment is using an MRI scanner. So it's using physical representation of the brain, so a physical picture of the brain, and then applying the computer algorithm to it from that. Now, one of the things that we're trying to do is to find, what things are proxies for things like brain age and cognitive reserve. So simple paper and pencil tests that might, be very strongly related to it. I mean, you don't need to get an MRI. So things like, recognizing words, for example, tends to be a good predictor of things like brain age, or semantic fluency, where, if I give you a minute to think of all the words that you can, starting with the letter B, things like that tend to correlate quite highly with brain age, but
Yeah.
they're proxies. They're not exactly the same thing.
Yeah. Okay, great. And a similar question, how can I get an MRI scan of my brain and a brain pad score?
So I think you could probably get an MRI if you pay for it. I know in America you can pay like $14,000 and get one of these kind of whole body health checks that the insurance companies sell you now. But I don't think that there's anybody doing a brain pad score as a commercial enterprise yet. I could be wrong about that, but it's all in a research context so far. So yeah, so we don't have it over here, though it's probably coming. But in America, if you've got the insurance, you can get an MRI of your brain and they'll look at it, but more for pathology and not for something like a brain pad score.
Yeah. And is there any research going on at the moment, say in your lab or in Trinity generally, that you're aware of, where they're recruiting maybe healthy adults, in this area of research?
Not just at the moment. Well, everything, of course, has stopped because of COVID, especially with older adults. So that's all being kicked in touch. But in time, there will be. And we're starting up a public patient interaction panel as well. So maybe I'll send you on details of that, Carol. So we've got funding to set up, to establish a panel of people, with Alzheimer's and their carers, and looking for healthy controls as well, to establish a panel for research that we can ask people, if you'd like to be involved, would you come in? And also, what do you think we should do, and give us help with our end of it as well. So I'd be very happy to share that, because I'm sure that when things get back to normal fairly shortly, we can use our brand new scanner for older adult studies. They're definitely on the cards.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I can put that on our website under the resources tab
sure.
as well. So it's all there in one place. People can have a look at that. There's a question about, you mentioned about the meditation, the research on meditation. What level of meditation was indicated in the study required on a daily basis?
So I can't recall from that study, but I think it was regular meditators. So there were people who, it was probably daily meditation. It wasn't just casual. I think it was a reanalysis of previous data where they selected out people who regularly meditated. So it was quite a lot. And some of it, of course, is tied up in cause and effect, that people who tend to meditate, they've got more time, they're less stressed anyway. So there's surely some of that going on as well, although they were closely matched. But so I think it was quite regular meditation. Yeah.
Okay. And actually, again, if you want to share that link with me, and I can put that up on our resources tab as well, just a link to the paper so people can have a look at it. That would be good. So someone has asked, what is cognitive remediation? It was on your slide on cognitive reserve.
So it's just a cognitive therapy to kind of help improve cognitive functioning. So it would be, one type of intervention for cognitive difficulties, and I'm sure that there's others as well, and they also contribute to the positive cognitive reserve. So anything that kind of engages and trains your brain to improve memory, for example, will be one thing. So if you feel your memory slipping, can you do something to address that, or train your processing speed, for example, as well?
Yeah. Okay, great. So question here, from a brain MRI, do you get a definite quantified fix on current levels of, say, amyloid or tau as predictors of trends towards dementia?
So that's the kind of thing you would get from a PET scan, so the positron emission tomography. So this is, it's the one that's a bit like MRI, except it involves the radioactive, very small amount of radioactivity. And from that, you can quantify those levels of amyloid anyway. So you can quantify the level of amyloid using a PET scanner, and you can quantify tau using other biomarkers as well. Again, there is, clinicians would have a cutoff, and they would know, what they're looking at. but things like cognitive reserve are really not that well understood. So in terms of something like cognitive reserve, you can have two people with the same amount of amyloid, and one of them has a completely different behavior to the other. So in one sense, yes, you can get a number that gives you the exact amount of amyloid in your brain, but then on the other hand, that may not translate so well into clinical symptoms.
Okay, great. Can a physical chronic pain condition that impacts mental health lead to dementia?
So just similar to the answer before, so anything, so the link between mental health and brain health is quite strong, and regardless of the cause of mental health difficulties, they have a knock-on effect on brain health. And that's certainly something that we're actively interested in, is this link between mental health and brain health, and then the Alzheimer's and dementia as well, many years later. So people who have poor mental health or mental ill health in their 20s and 30s, how does this have an effect, or does this have an effect on dementia later on? And we don't really know that very well at the moment, because we don't have longitudinal studies that cover that, but that's one of the things we're actively working on now, is to try and better link mental health to brain health.
Yeah. Okay, great. Are word game predictions for brain age anyway reliable?
To some extent. So anything that engages your cognitive system in a robust way is going to be a proxy measure for something like brain age. So semantic fluency, for example, that's where you're naming animals or just words. That's a pretty good predictor of brain age. So something like word game predictions would be, yes. So they all, the words in particular seem to be good at tapping into brain age, but not perfect, but they're a decent proxy, yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. How must we improve brain health negative emotions? So, or how can we improve, I suppose, negative emotions? So I suppose that's quite a broad.
Yeah, so I suppose that's a question about mood, and and obviously a negative mood will impact on your brain health. So some of this comes down to things like stress, and alleviating stress, and recognizing triggers for low mood and negative emotions as well. And then there's various types of interventions that you can do. So you can do things, there's apps like meditation apps or mindfulness apps that help people a lot with negative emotions. I think nowadays, you can get them on your phone, and it just teaches you to maybe let those negative emotions wash over you a bit more, and not be so, not ruminate on them for a long time. I mean, that would be, for a fairly mild case. If it's more than that, if it's persistent low mood, then people should go and see a GP, and talk to somebody professionally about that.
Yeah. Okay, great. So someone's asking here about risk in terms of medication. So particularly blood pressure medication and SSRIs. So I'm guessing they're asking whether they would reduce your risk of dementia or other brain disease.
Well, I mean, I think things like high blood pressure and anxiety or depression, things that would be treated with SSRIs, will be risks for poor brain health. So if you're taking medication to alleviate that, that's probably on balance going to be a good thing, because hypertension, for example, is not conducive to good brain health. So treating that with medication would have a knock-on effect on your brain health in a good way, that you will be reducing that high blood pressure, because the brain is very vascular, and things like high blood pressure are not good, and treating that will be better. So those kind of things would lower the risk. Again, if SSRIs improve mood or reduce anxiety, then that would also improve mental health, and ultimately improve brain health that way.
Okay. Someone has asked, can we request an MRI brain scan to see where we're at? I know you were saying, obviously someone can pay privately, but I suppose if someone, I guess they're probably talking to their GP or consultant about requesting a brain scan.
Yeah, so they won't, people over here won't clinically ask for an MRI scan in the absence of symptoms. I mean, in the absence of symptoms, there's almost never anything there. Again, in America, this is a business. Like people, private hospitals have MRI scans, and people will go and get them. But to be honest, they're not that useful because there is still so much individual variability, and there's no single number that you can put on somebody and give them a very clear answer. This idea of personalized medicine is some way off in the future, and you could have two MRI scans that look identical, and people could be totally different, and there's still lots of other factors there. And I think even just practically, it's not possible to order those kind of scans, and it would just be a radiologist looking at it. But if you have symptoms, then that would be a time to order a scan or to talk to someone about it. But in the absence of symptoms, on almost never see anything. So we have people coming in as controls the whole time, and in the absence of any symptoms, you almost never see anything there. It's maybe some trivial stuff, but people without symptoms tend not to have abnormal MRIs.
Yeah. Okay. And another question on MRI scans. So if you have MRIs for an individual, is it possible to have their images read anywhere to get brain pad score? I'm guessing not, unless they're taking part in a particular research project. But
yes, exactly. Yeah. So it's not. So it's just an algorithm. I'm sure at some point somebody will post it up, or make a little toolbox that you can feed it in. But but not at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. Someone's asking about earlier treatment interventions. Are they successful enough to offset the depression and upset that would come from knowing you're heading for dementia? So
very much on an individual basis, and for some people, certainly there's counselling and things like that that do help. And I'm thinking more of things like Huntington's, where it's a certainty and people know with absolute surety 100% that something is in your future, and then there is counseling around that to deal with it. I mean, I guess dementia is slightly different in some senses because it's not as defined, and the core system is defined, but certainly there are people who do counsel around that area, of future ill health.
Yeah, and certainly, we would always say that earlier diagnosis is always better because people can tap into resources and all the rest. So yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Better. Yeah. Someone's asking about small vessel brain disease, which is probably getting a bit into the medical side of things, but in terms of, they're asking about health-wise or in their diet, what they can do. Now, we have run a few webinars as part of this series. One of them was specifically on nutrition, actually. So this person, if they wanted to go onto the YouTube channel, Dementia Research Network Ireland YouTube channel, and there's kind of specific talks there on general health and nutrition. That's probably the best thing to say about that one. And we will also be doing an Ask the Experts webinar on the 24th of May, and Rob is going to be at that, and we'll have a consultant geriatrician at that as well. So there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at that event as well. So we have a bit more time. I know we said we'd wrap up by 2:15, but if people are able to stay on, we can take a few more questions, because I know you have lots of questions coming in. So I'll just see what else we have here. So do you research how well-being coaching and yoga influence the brain?
So not me specifically, but certainly people are looking at this. We do a little bit around mindfulness as well. So we had a mindfulness intervention, like an 8-week mindfulness intervention, and we looked at that, but then COVID happened right in the middle of that, so that got shelved. But people are certainly looking at that, in terms of otherwise healthy people doing things like yoga and mindfulness, and just trying to improve their mental health, from a fairly high baseline, and looking at that too. Yeah. So not me specifically, but certainly people are looking at that.
Okay. Someone's asking about, can MRI and FMRI scanners replace diagnostics in the future?
That would be the ultimate goal, I think, for us, would be to have some kind of algorithm where you could put somebody in an MRI scanner, maybe, do some FMRI as well, and then give them some kind of diagnostic information from that. So it's some way off in the future. It's this idea of personalized medicine, but it is what we're working towards. some kind of quick, ideally you could put somebody in for 5 minutes in an MRI scanner and you could get enough information to give some kind of useful information there, or to give some kind of physician assisted information as well. So this is where and people have looked at this more in depression and areas like that, where the physicians, make a judgment call, but then they get some extra information as well from something biological like an MRI scan. So it doesn't give the whole, condition, but it also, just helps feed in some extra information in there. And that's been relatively successful, that physicians tend to make better judgments when they're being given, a score, maybe there's a score between 0 and 100 as to, the likelihood of MCI or something like that. And, that might help them make a decision, but, a lot of it will still be the kind of personal interaction there. But the goal is to more objectively do that in the future, yes.
Yeah. Okay. And I suppose this links in with some of the previous questions. Will you definitely get dementia if you suffer from depression? So I'll just let you answer that.
No, there's a link there, but it's a statistical link. It's not a causal or mechanistic link. So people with depression tend to have a higher rate, but doesn't necessarily mean one leads to the other. Could be joint factors there, or just depression, cause stress, and that stress can be physically impacted on. But certainly lots of people with depression don't get dementia, and lots of people without depression do get dementia. So it's just a risk factor in a statistical sense. And for any one person, it's not, you can't really infer anything for any one person, over, if you had 1,000 people, you could probably look at the odds, but no, there's not a one-to-one link there.
Yeah. So not a foregone conclusion, like a lot of these risk factors we've been talking about. I think it's a question that comes up quite a bit, actually, where people are thinking about their individual case and going, okay, if I have this particular condition, is it a foregone conclusion? But, I suppose important to say that it never is, which is what you're saying.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is that people in general, everybody, statisticians, medics, people who don't deal with those, are very bad at estimating risk as well, to understand the risk factor. So even like just, having a bad set of genes is maybe a 10% extra risk. It's not really that much. All these things are tiny really, and the likelihood of them impacting on you is still quite small. Like the probabilities are low in all these things really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And someone's asking, is there a relation between trauma in younger age and dementia?
I don't know. That's a good question, and that's something we are trying to look at. Part of the reason that we don't know that is we just don't have enough cohort information. People who are now in their 70s or 80s we don't have records on those people going back for things like childhood trauma, which is maybe a more recent thing to ask about. So there's there's a couple of big birth cohort studies, but they wouldn't have asked those kind of questions, and they wouldn't have had that information. In future, we'll know, because we'll ask people now or within the last 20 years about childhood trauma, and we'll see what happens, but right now we don't know. But it's a good question, and something that we're trying to do, is to establish these younger cohorts with better information, and then in future we'll see if there is a link there.
Yeah. Okay, great. So someone asking about a recording and a copy of the slides. So the recording will be on our YouTube channel, and the slides will be on our website, which is dementianetwork.ie, and I'll put them up straight after this webinar, so they'll be there under the resources tab. Okay, so can low pressure medication affect your brain health? That's probably low blood pressure medication, which I think we've answered already.
So I think probably specific questions like that, if you're worried, a GP would be a good person to ask, or the whoever kind of person you deal with. I know Professor Roseanne Kenny, that's her area of expertise. They look at this a lot, in terms of medication and so on, but it's really quite a specialized area.
Yeah. Someone's asking about mindset towards aging and brain health. Now, just to say to you that one of the webinars in this series, we had Dr. Annalisa Setti and Fergus Fawcett who presented. It's again on our YouTube channel under this brain health series. So there was a bit there on mindset. So I might just suggest that person looks up that. It probably will answer all your questions. It was actually a very interesting little piece there in one of the webinars. So that's a question on diet, which again, we've done a webinar on. Sorry, I won't go into every single question just for the sake of time, because we have a lot of questions. An interesting question. Are you worried about how insurance companies will tap into this information in the future?
Yeah, so that's a live enough question. Probably apart from insurance companies, something like Google. So they've recently got into the California. So I think that they've either looked at it, or it would be good for them to, or they're interested in looking into kind of health data like that, where you can access people's MRI scans. So these kind of big data companies would, I think, be interested in it, probably from a research point of view initially, but there are, if you had all the information in a health record for a whole country, you could probably start to do something. And then I think there is a danger there, a moral hazard, that if you're at a statistically high risk of a stroke or something like that, that you're not going to get insurance company or insurance cover. So so I think there is a risk that might happen, and the people probably need to legislate against it. But at the same, and I think it would be unfair, because all of these things are again probabilistic and risk, and just because you've got a high risk of having something doesn't obviously doesn't mean that it's going to happen to you. So
okay. And there's a question there about, does diabetes affect the brain? So I think the answer is yes to that. I don't know if you wanted to say anything about diabetes.
Not that I'm especially aware of, just to say that the brain is obviously very vascular, so there's a lot of it uses up a lot of a lot of blood goes through your brain every second, and a lot of things that are related to vascular health are also brain health issues. So people with good vascular health or poor vascular health tend to be differentially affected, but I'm not especially sure about diabetes, to be honest.
Yeah, and actually there is someone in our network who will be doing research starting around now, actually, in relation to diabetes and brain health. So we might be able to report something in maybe a year or two in relation to that. Do games like chess or computer games count as learning for positive brain effects?
Yes, yeah. So the main thing is that they challenge you. So something like chess, for example, will be, there's a lot of memory there, trying to memorize the openings, and then you've got to do some forward planning. Maybe 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6 moves ahead. So the thing about something like chess is that it's demanding. It needs to be something reasonably demanding that's going to push your system a bit. So it's not, if you're doing like kind of kids word search or something like that, it's not very demanding. Eventually you'll get it. It needs to be something more engaging to kind of push the system a bit. So something complex and like chess is a good example. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So we might just take 1 or 2 more questions, and thanks, Rob, for answering all these questions being thrown at you. Has the PET scan research been repeated by any other researchers? And are there any research papers available online on brain health, especially links between brain health, mental health, and degenerative brain diseases?
Yeah, so the PET scan is very well established. It's quite routine in the States. And in certain countries, if people are suspected, or if they need to do a differential diagnosis, for example, between, like, distinguishing between Alzheimer's and some other kind of dementia, that would be the kind of scan that they would use specifically to check that it is Alzheimer's or that there is amyloid there. It's not done that routinely, just because clinically there's other things to do. But different countries have different ways of approaching this issue. So somewhere like the States, they've been doing PET for a long time. That's not so common here, but it's possible probably to get it. And then the link between it, I guess I look at the academic literature, but maybe this series that the RNI are running is probably a great place to start actually to try and find these links as well, and to maybe read a little bit about it. So some of those references that I put in there, I think most of them are open access of the ones that I put in that you can look at, and I'm sure that DRNI have other recommendations on accessible places to get good sources of information.
Yeah, great. So we might just take one last question. So it's how to distinguish between normal reduction in memory, word finding, etc., and the point when it becomes a clinical issue.
So a clinician would, an expert clinician would be able to tell that difference, to distinguish between what would be seen as normal aging versus what would be seen as abnormal for that person's age. So everybody does a bit more word searching and so on as they get older, and everybody's brain and memory changes, and then it's really a clinician is that's really their job, is to try and distinguish that, which can be very difficult. It's not that easy. There might not be a clear cut response there, but that's a clinical judgment ultimately at the end of the day.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rob. So just to mention next Monday's webinar, so the next webinar in our series is on rejuvenating your brain, learn how simple lifestyle changes can boost your brain health and reduce your risk of developing dementia. And that's going to be presented by Dr. Sabina Brennan. So you can see, there's a lot of crossover in these webinars. So I think it's great because there's so much interest, obviously, and so many questions coming through that obviously it's a topic that really is of interest to people. So just to say thank you very much to Rob Whelan for presenting today and answering all those questions. And thanks very much to everyone who logged on today. It sounds like we had a very international audience, so great to have all our Irish colleagues and friends and everyone from around the world joining in. And sorry we couldn't answer all the questions, but we will be doing another webinar which Rob will be taking part in on the 24th of May. So that's all on our Eventbrite website, and you can book tickets there. So thanks again and have a great day.